me. I'm Jessica Aguilé. I'm the organizer with the Alliance for a Green Economy, also called AGREE. And we are the sponsor of this event. And I just want to let you know the members of AGREE are the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, the Citizens Environmental Coalition, Peace Action New York State, Peace Action CNY, and the CNY chapter of Citizens Awareness Network, and the Syracuse Peace Council. So it's some local organizations and also some statewide organizations. And we work for safe, affordable energy and the development of a green economy in New York State. And part of working for a safe and affordable energy is working to change corporate and governmental policies that support dangerous and dirty energy sources. And that's why we planned this event today. A year ago, on March 11th, the world was reminded once again just how dangerous nuclear power is. An enormous earthquake and tsunami killed over 20,000 people, and it also damaged a nuclear power station, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, which housed 6 reactors. And our guests are going to go into a lot more detail about what that disaster, the details of that disaster. But it's important to remember that the main cause, or one of the main reasons why there were meltdowns at Fukushima was the tsunami knocked out the power. It took out the backup generators, and as a result, the plants lost coolant, and that caused a chain reaction. And we don't really know the full consequences of the Fukushima nuclear disaster yet, but what makes it most tragic to me is that it was entirely preventable. For decades, small groups of activists, nuclear watchdogs, had been warning that nuclear power was unsafe, and they had even pointed out that this nuclear complex was vulnerable to a large tsunami. And the government and the Tokyo Electric Power, the corporation that owns the plant, pretty much just ignored them. And just like in the US, Japan had kind of a toothless regulation structure. And Tim Judson's going to talk a lot about regulation in the US today. If you Google Fukushima warnings, you'll come across tons of articles detailing all the ways in which common Japanese citizens, scientists, and nuclear watchdogs had been warning that something like Fukushima could happen. But as the Japanese Prime Minister, the one currently, put it last week, quote, "The government, as well as operators and academia, were steeped too deeply in the safety myth of nuclear power." So the lesson that I take from this is that we need to listen to our own nuclear watchdogs here in the United States. And today we have 3 of them, 3 great activists and nuclear watchdogs here who are going to talk a lot about nuclear power. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. This is Stephen Penn. He's a professor of physics at Hobart William Smith Colleges. He's a tireless local activist and educator and a valuable resource locally on the technical aspects of nuclear reactors and their dangers. He's also involved in a number of energy and environmental related organizations, including the CNY Public Power Coalition. And then we have Paul Gunter. He's a lead spokesperson in nuclear reactor hazards and security concerns, and he acts as the regulatory watchdog over the regulatory watchdog over the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the nuclear power industry. He's currently the director of the Reactor Oversight Project at Beyond Nuclear, which is a DC area organization. And Beyond Nuclear advocates for an energy future that is sustainable, benign, and democratic. And then we have Tim Judson, who's the president of Citizens Awareness Network, also known as CAN. It's a grassroots environmental organization working to end the use of nuclear power in the Northeast. And a lot of you might know Tim. He used to live in Syracuse until a few years ago. And he's been instrumental in the local movement to address health and safety concerns at our local reactors.
So if no one minds, I'm going to stand while I do my presentation because I'm just used to that from doing lectures every week. And it's too bad the contrast a little bit. If you get a chance, get online and Google some pictures from Fukushima, because it's interesting, given all of the disaster pictures that you see, to see what the plant looked like before the disaster and the quality of the plant that existed prior to the disaster. This had a little bit better contrast. You can see that this is how it's maintained. It looks to be an extremely clean and well-maintained plant before disaster struck. And of course, then if we focus on these 4 reactors here, and this is what they look like after the tsunami. Okay, after the tsunami, and then the explosions in the plants. So I just want to talk a little bit about the basics of nuclear power and some of the lessons that we can learn. First, everybody who's here is probably familiar with some of the dangers of nuclear power, the possibility for explosions like this, exposure to radioactivity, the type of mutations that can cause in living beings, and the problems with the long-term storage of nuclear waste. People might not always be familiar with what the attractions are with nuclear power. Why is it that we would be enamored with having this in the first place? And I think that this is a really telling slide, in that nuclear power that we get from fissionable plants is basically, from a physicist's perspective, the same nuclear power that powers the sun, that is basically the source of all energy that we have. Except with the sun, you're building up more complex nuclei and gaining energy, whereas with fissionable plants, you're taking complex nuclei that were created in a supernova billions of years ago, and you're breaking them down and releasing that stored energy. But it's basically the fact that nuclear bonds have about 1,000,000 times greater energy stored in them than the atomic and molecular bonds that are the source of chemical power. So if you're burning fossil fuels, any kind of combustion, any type of chemical reaction, those processes are simply much weaker. That can be also demonstrated in the fact that 1 kilogram pellet of uranium fuel is equal to about 3,000 tons of coal, or 14,000 barrels of oil. So you can see the allure, because in a fissionable plant, during the fission process, you have the production of very few greenhouse gases. So for those people who are concerned about the environment, this may seem like an attractive alternative. Right? In addition, for some countries, we don't do this in the United States, but the chain reaction process actually takes some of the ore material that is existing within the pellets and makes it usable for fuel in the future. So it becomes a big benefit in the overall efficiency if you can then reprocess that fuel, okay, as is done in France. And just to give you a basic idea of what's happening in the plant, here's the basic reaction that's occurring in the center of all of these plants. You have uranium-235, which is somewhat unique in these large transuranic nuclei, in that it wants a cold neutron. And this is important. It wants a neutron that is moving slowly to come in, combine, and form this sort of metastable state, which then, like a water droplet, splits in half into 2, and then you have the production of these gamma rays. This is the ultimate source of the power that we're getting, is the production of these gamma rays that are absorbed, and then that eventually heats the water that powers the plant. When we mine uranium, it exists primarily in 2 forms, uranium-235 and uranium-238. Uranium-238, very long half-life, sort of on the age of the Earth half-life, and it's the vast majority of the uranium that we see. Uranium-235, much shorter, but still, by our terms, very long half-life, and it has about a 0.5% abundance. This basically accounts for all the uranium that we see naturally. Here's that fissionable process where we're bringing in the thermal neutron here, and that causes the uranium to split. But the important part about this end production here is that you're producing 2 neutrons in the end. So you're putting 1 in, you're taking 2 out, and they're hot. if you have a way of taking these neutrons and cooling them down, they can feed back. So this is how you get the chain reaction. The hot neutron is emitted, but it's thermalized by passing normally through water. There are variations on this, but normally through water. And then it's captured by the uranium. That causes the uranium to fission, and you get the production of the hot neutron again. And this is going to be a chain reaction that can build cataclysmically if you don't control it. And the way that nuclear plants control it is they have control rods that are formed from two substances, boron and cadmium, both which absorb neutrons. So you have what could be a very cataclysmic reaction if this absorption of neutrons is not properly controlled. In order to make the fuel, you have to what we do is we make pellets. And there isn't simply naturally enough uranium-235, the necessary uranium component, to cause the chain reaction. And so we have to enrich the uranium up to about between 3 and 5% to sustain the reaction. When people talk about nuclear power being very carbon zero or carbon neutral, what they're ignoring is this process, where you have to refine and enrich that uranium ore. That uses about 10% of the overall energy that is eventually derived from the uranium fuel. And that process is powered, in this country at least, by fossil fuels. There are other experimental methods for this, but mostly by fossil fuels. And so that's a very carbon-intensive process that is usually ignored when people talk about the benefits of nuclear power. Overall, better than burning oil if you're just talking about carbon production. When we're talking about the accidents, there's going to be an important component that is going to reoccur. So I want to introduce this topic here, which is that the fuel rods are housed within a metal, which is a zirconium alloy. And that's important because it's able to withstand the harsh conditions of being within the reactor core. However, if that zirconium alloy is exposed to very, very high temperature steam, it will oxidize. And in that process, it'll melt and it'll produce hydrogen gas, which, as we all know, is quite explosive and was the source for the explosions in Fukushima. I'm not going to delve into the fact of the specifics of the local plants. I think Paul's going to do more on that. But just to point out that if you look at the 6 plants that are in New York State, you'll see that the 3 that are closest to us are all boiling water reactors. And these 2, 9 Mile Point 1 and Fitzpatrick, are the exact same design as used in the Fukushima plants. What do we mean by, well, this is really not coming out as clearly as it's showing on my slide, but I think you'll get the basic idea. So what do we mean by when we talk about boiling water reactor and pressurized water reactors? Okay? What happens in a nuclear plant is very similar to most of our power plants. Most of our power plants use steam generation to turn a turbine. That's the same thing whether it's a gas plant or it's a nuclear plant. If you're talking about what's happening out here, where the steam is turning turbines and it's compressing the water again and going back into the heat source. But in this case, the heat source is the reaction chamber where you're having all the fission occur. And so in a boiling water reactor, the same water that's coming in and thermalizing the neutrons and is being exposed to the nuclear fuel is the same water that's then carried through the turbines and through the condenser pumps and the demineralizers, etc. And so
can you go slower on that one, please?
Oh, sure. Thanks for slowing me down. What happens in a boiling water reactor is you have one water loop. So the same water that is coming in and flowing around the nuclear fuel is the same water that's coming out through the steam lines and flowing past the turbine generators. Okay?
I've got a question on that one.
All right.
Okay, so it's going in to the core and it's cooling the core?
That's correct. And it's thermalizing the neutrons as well.
Is it doing that?
It can do that. So if anything is leaching out of the fuel rods, yes, it can pick it up. And you have demineralizers that are there to partially filter that water. And in addition, there are gases that are produced in the fission process. For example, 2 slides ago, you saw that one of the main products coming out of the fission process is krypton. That's a gas. Mm-hmm. And you get other noble gases that are formed, and you can get both the stable and the unstable isotopes. And those gases are then stripped out of the water. So you do have the production of radioactivity that can get into this water line. In fact, you have the people that are working in this area have to be badged for radiation exposure.
Yeah, I was wondering, because see, once it goes into the turbine generator, then if it's radioactive, it's going to affect anybody who's working there, correct?
They don't work in there during the plant operation. They're not in the turbine hall because it is radioactive. There's a gamma field in the turbine building that prohibits workers being in that section.
Thank you.
While you've paused, please explain the recirculator pumps versus the feed pumps. It sort of looks like you got 2 loops, but you're saying really it's basically 1 loop.
This is just to allow for good recirculation within and around the rods.
Of the same basic water.
Right.
Okay.
With the pressurized water reactor, so for example with the Rochester plant, you have 2 loops. So you have 1 loop here that is flowing by the fuel rods, and then that's going through a heat exchanger here where the cooler water from the outer loop is then passing by and picking up this heat. The nice thing about it is that if you have radioactive contaminants that get into this loop, unless there's leaking in between these 2, which can happen, then you're confining that basically to this inner loop rather than to the outer loop. Okay? But you also have to worry about then filtering, pulling out the noble gases that have gotten into this water, pulling out any other contaminants. Okay, well, we gotta hurry here, folks. I'm talking too long. All right, I'm going to skip over nuclear waste, except to say that when the waste is initially pulled out of the reaction chamber, it's stored in a fuel pool, and this fuel pool is located for these Mark I reactors up here. Okay, so you have this spent fuel pool that's located around the top of the reactor vessel. And here's a picture of one here, which is glowing a little bit due to the shrink-off radiation reacting with the water. I'm not going to talk about radioactive decay over time. Just going to say here that anytime you build a power plant, because of the high pressures involved, because of the fuel involved, you can get explosions. Okay? The difference is if you have an explosion at a nuclear plant, the kind of contamination that can go with it. So I'm going to step really quickly then through accidents you might be familiar with and then talk about Fukushima. For 3 Mile Island, this is the largest accident at a commercial nuclear power plant. And let's look what caused this. You had a feed water pump. This is what's circulating the water back through the coolant chain, and a pump failed. That pump failure caused the reactor to scram. So the control rods are fully inserted to stop the reaction, but one problem is that although the auxiliary backup pump started, the valve connecting that to the system failed. So you had a failure of a pump, and you had a failure of a valve that was not often used. And a warning light indicated that that valve wasn't working, but it was blocked from the operator's view. So you have 2 mechanical failures here that just happen to align, and then you have 1 human failure. That's the difference in these colors here. When the water wasn't flowing through the reactor vessel, now there's nothing pulling that heat out, so now the reactor vessel is starting to overpressure. To keep it from blowing up, there is a pressure relief valve, and it can open. It doesn't get used very often, and when it got open, it remains stuck open. So 2 valves that aren't used very often, they both were not operating correctly. either not opening or staying open. That causes there to be rising heat in the reactor vessel, and that triggered a cooling system, but the operator didn't understand why the cooling system wasn't working, because he didn't understand that there was poor water flow, because he didn't see the warning light, and so he intervened and turned down the core cooling system for a few minutes. So you have now human error once again, okay? So you have insufficient core cooling, you have a venting of steam, and that's causing the reactor core to overheat because there's a lack of water. You're losing water into the containment building, right? But you're not having more cool water being brought in. This is overheating. The zirconium alloy fuel rod clad starts to melt, and as I reminded you before, that causes the production of hydrogen gas that then flows out through this stuck open valve, and you have a hydrogen gas bubble that's forming within the containment building. This was eventually vented, but there was a lot of concern that there might have been a spark to set this off. There's other analysis that says maybe there wasn't enough concentration of hydrogen to actually have an explosion, but we'll see that that doesn't always occur. Okay? I'm just going to step quickly through this. There are various estimates as to whether how many deaths resulted from the release of radioactivity, whether that was 1 as the NRC estimates, or whether it was 100 times that. It's very hard to actually track that because you can't actually trace, I'm going to go a little bit over, you can't actually trace cancers to their source. Let's talk about Chernobyl. Chernobyl Reactor 4 exploded and melted down in 1986. This plant operates in a slightly different way, and it uses a graphite block rather than a water system to dissipate the heat. This is great in that you don't get the contaminant spread into the water system, and there's no formation of hydrogen gas, but the problem is you have to keep air away from that hot carbon block. If that carbon block is extremely hot, and if you have it exposed to air, it'll oxidize, quickly burn, and explode. And that's exactly what happened. So you had these unauthorized low power tests. When that reactor is in its low power state, it's not stable. You have a lot of feedback loops that are controlling this very volatile reaction. And there are places in its operation where that feedback isn't stable. And when it's operating at low power, they were having trouble coming up with controls that allowed that to be stable. That's why they were doing the tests in the first place. But when they were doing these tests, there was a sudden power spike. It caused an intense thermal and pressure shock, and that cracked the reactor vessel. That is the problem. It let in air, the graphite ignited, and it very quickly exploded. That fire destroyed the plant. 31 workers died trying to put the fire out. And 350,000 people had to be evacuated. There were very high levels of contamination along western Russia and eastern Europe. Various estimates as to how many people died, ranging from 4,000 to 200,000. Here's a picture of what happened. Again, this is not very clear, but this is where the plant was. Okay, and you can see this incredible explosion in the building next door, just obliterated. And the level of fallout. Okay, you really, I don't know what's going on with this projector, but you can't see all of Europe behind here, but it exists. Europe exists, whether you can see it on this map or not. And so here we go. You can see this is spreading all through Ukraine, Belarus, up into Scandinavia, down through Central Europe. These are the fallout patterns from strontium-90 and cesium-137. Let's quickly talk about Fukushima. We all know there was a magnitude 9 or higher earthquake that occurred 70 kilometers off the northeast coast. It sent in a 40-meter tsunami wave, which if you haven't seen, get online and look at this. It's absolutely just devastating what that wave was able to do. So at the time, only units 1, 2, and 3 were operating. Units 4, 5, and 6 were shut down. 1, 2, and 3 had full meltdowns, but only 1 and 3 had hydrogen explosions. You also had a hydrogen explosion in reactor 4. And reactor 2's containment was damaged by the explosions in unit 1 and 3. The radioactive releases, luckily for the people of Japan, the prevailing winds were to the northeast and blew most of the radioactive contaminants and gas out to sea. Otherwise, if it had been blowing in the other direction, it is estimated to be at least of the level of Chernobyl as far as the level of contaminants were put into the atmosphere. And okay, so units 1 and 3 at full power, 4 through 6 were refueling. The earthquake causes shutdowns at 1 through 3. The seismic system cuts in. They immediately scram. These cooling systems require 60,000 gallons per minute of water to keep these hot cores cool. But the tsunami knocks out power. I'll show you images of why that was in a second. And so the safety systems outside power is now required to keep these systems cool. That usually means backup diesel generators, but the generators were flooded and a lot of the tanks were actually swept away in the tsunami. So the backup for the backup is DC power. That normally works for 8 hours. That's true on units 2 and 3, but unit 1 is only has 90 minutes because its backup DC power system hadn't been upgraded. So units 2 through 3 had 8 hours, but unit 1 is going to explode first. In addition, because you don't have backup power, the spent fuel pools in all the units remain uncooled. Okay, and you need to keep them cool in order that they don't boil off their thermalizing water. And it's thought that the reason why Unit 4 exploded is that when Unit 3, right next to it, exploded, it caused a leak in the fuel pool. The water leaked out. That spent fuel was then exposed, and then that overheated and burned. This exposed core cladding, as I mentioned before, when it melts, because you have a loss of coolant, reacts with the water and produces the hydrogen gas. As I mentioned, the DC backup power was knocked out, so here you have a view from above. This is Unit 1 that's here. I guess it's right there, actually. These are the diesel tanks for Unit 1 before the tsunami. And after the tsunami, this is where the tanks were. Here's one of them knocked down the road here. This is the blown up Unit 1. Here's Unit 1 exploding. I don't think any of these are actually going to come out very well in this projector. This is Unit 3. You can see that well, if you look at this online, you can see the hydrogen plume here from the explosion. And then finally, this is Unit 3 going up. Picture Unit 3 blowing up. Just the level of devastation for Unit 1, etc. And this is 1 and 3. So what about accident potential in the U.S.? I think it's important to remember here. In Fukushima, we have a large natural disaster. But what did it essentially do? It's essentially just basically knocking out the source of the backup power. So anything that can do that is going to cause a problem for us. Okay? Is going to, and look at those first two accidents, right? For 3 Mile Island, you had 2 stuck valves and a broken pump. How often can things like that happen? How often can you have simple mistakes that lead to big accidents? It's not that you can't have accidents at other power plants. It's that when you have accidents at other power plants, you have some spilled fuel, oil, etc. You don't have the level of contamination that's is familiar to you from a nuclear power accident. I passed out these sheets. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists. They've been doing a bang-up job as far as monitoring the safety conditions. I would suggest all of you look at that, read over them. In the interest of time, I won't go into a lot of these problems except to say that you can have what appear to be simple problems like a problem with electrical systems as they had at the Braidwood plant, that can cause these reactors to shut down. And in this case, for example, the electrical problem caused the unit to shut down, but the safety systems that were put into place malfunctioned. There was a leak. The plant was then flooded, and that caused electrical short that shut down the next plant. So anything that can cause leaking, loss of coolant, look down this list, you'll see a couple of the reactors have problems with their water cooling systems not being charged and ready to go, or their water cooling systems having leaks, and so would not have worked properly if you have a reactor accident. And lastly, just to finish up here, we have to consider, how does this impact us? We have in Oswego Mark I reactors, and these Mark I reactors are the same design as we see at Fukushima. Right? So could you have a system where the backup generators fail, or the backup DC power simply doesn't last because we can't get to those plants? We have had major, although not devastating, earthquakes in this area. Messina, which is reasonably close, had a 5.8 magnitude in 44. We have had ice storms or other large storms that have prevented us from having access to the plants. Anything that basically limits our ability to come in and fix them, or that might cause those generators to go offline, is a problem, is a potential for accident. In addition, these plants are very old. The pipes within them are getting stress corrosion cracking. Those piping systems are getting weak. If you have an earthquake of this magnitude, all you have to do is basically cause a major rupture in one of those cooling pipes, and you have now what is a serious potential for accident. So with that, I'm sorry for going over a little bit, but I'm going to...
Steve, could you put up the Mark I diagram before you...
Sure. Let me go back. I don't know if I have a way of doing this quickly.
That's all right.
But we could go ahead and move on to the program while you get that lined up again. Before we turn it over to Paul, we just wanted to gauge a little bit what people know about our reactors in New York State to get a sense. And you heard some facts in Steve's presentation, and you might have glanced at the map we had up here. But I just wanted to throw out a few questions and kind of see where people are at. So do folks know how many reactors we have operating in New York State right now? 3.
Oh, no.
In the whole state, statewide?
6.
So we have 6 reactors in 3 different locations. Do people know generally where those are located? What are our locations of reactors in New York State?
Scriba and down at 9 Mile.
Okay, so Scriba up near Oswego, up on Lake Ontario.
And then the 9 Mile is in Westchester County. And
Westchester County, which is Indian Point.
Right,
Okay.
and then
So we have 2 reactors there. How many reactors up by Oswego? 3 reactors up by Oswego. Where's our
Missing reactors.
Where's our missing reactor?
Rochester.
Near Rochester. Anybody know the name of that one? Guinea. Okay, so we have Guinea by Rochester. Up in Oswego, what are our plants up there?
Fitzgerald.
Fitzpatrick.
9 Mile 1 and 2.
That's 9 Mile 1 and 2.
Right.
Downstate we have
Indian Point 1 and 2.
Indian Point 1 and 2. That's great.
2 and 3.
And 2 and 3, right. Indian Point 1, does anybody know why we don't have an operating Indian Point 1 in Westchester County?
Is that the crack in the basement?
Indian Point 1 was shut down about 12 years after it started. It was shut down in 74, I think, because of ongoing problems and safety concerns. So that's why we have an operating 2 and 3 and not an operating number 1. And so we talked a little bit, and Paul will go into more details about the Mark I boiling water reactor. We have 2 of those in New York State. Do people know where they are of those 3 sites we talked about?
The boiling water? The Scriba one.
The Mark,
Both in Oswego.
both in Oswego, so that would be Fitzpatrick and 9 Mile Point 1.
Mhm.
So, great, so and I hope you'll check out, we have 2 things that we're trying to do to help people understand what nuclear power means for us in New York State. We have this fact sheet on this yellow paper that's a quick snapshot with some basic facts about each of those reactors, who owns them, when they came into operation, some tidbits we might be of particular interest in. And then we have this map here, and one of the things it shows for us is those 50-mile circles. We chose 50 miles because when the accident happened at Fukushima, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission told Americans living there to evacuate an area 50 miles around that plant. So that's what we're showing here. And I think sometimes people think, there's been a lot of attention to the plants downstate, and people think the ones in upstate are in the middle of nowhere. These plants in Oswego, within that 50 miles, there are almost 1 million people. The plant near Rochester, there are over 1 million people in that 50-mile radius. So that's I think, really important to us. I hope you'll take a minute to look at that afterwards.